Hi, my name is Ethan Harris. I'm a anthropology PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'm presenting here a research paper I conducted with Professor Chris Lawson, also of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. It's titled, "What We Should Do Is, Are We More Willing to Defer to Experts Who Provide Descriptive Facts than Those Who Offer Prescriptive Advice?" Just a little intro. We all know that we rely on experts and expertise. Your toilet breaks, you gotta call a plumber. You have a problem with your car, you have to go to a car mechanic. So we know how to identify experts, and we also know how to identify when we need to rely on expertise based on a lack of our own knowledge or understanding. Yet there is still a tendency to not rely on experts and expertise. So here we wanted to look into why. Just some background. Generally, deference to experts and expertise falls upon a dynamic between trust and vigilance. We tend to trust that we're being provided relevant info, and we also tend to trust that domain experts' theories of concepts contain essential information that we're not privy to as laypersons. But we're not trusting to the degree that we're gullible. We do maintain epistemic vigilance. This is displayed as early as 5 years old, as children are able to judge informants based upon past reliability, identity or status, and also degree of domain expertise. And also in adults, human reasoning has been theorized as primarily affording the ability to analyze and present favorable arguments, and that is dependent upon a considerable degree of vigilance. So while most of this work has focused on our ability to assess the content of the information presented by an informant, here we wanted to explore whether the form in which the information is shared by experts will impact our willingness to defer. To this, we wanted to frame expertise as either descriptive information or prescriptive advice. So an example, descriptive would just be a presentation of information that vaccines have numerous benefits, whereas in the prescriptive condition, you should get vaccinated because vaccines have said numerous benefits. So our prediction was that participants will be less willing to defer to experts when giving prescriptive advice than when given descriptive facts. We came to this because while both statements contain the same factual expertise, the prescriptive or deontic statements actually communicate additional information. So where the descriptive framing answers the question about what something is, prescriptive framing answers both what something is, but also what to do about that something. So it implies that there's a potential action to be taken, which adds an additional judgment to be made, and thus where greater vigilance may be required because prescriptive statements reference more of an immediate context because of that judgment about whether or not one needs to take action. Additionally, prescriptive statements also take what may be a general fact and now present it as more of a specific assertion. So these two aspects are what we focused on. An example item here, you have the descriptive and the prescriptive framing. So in both, you first establish the expertise of our hypothetical expert here, Dr. Riley, head of the Experimental Research Division, well-known expert physician. And then Dr. Riley claims the latest research shows that the use of MDMA will reduce symptoms by 40% after just 6 treatments. In contrast, in the prescriptive framing, still have the establishment of the expertise, head of experimental research, yada yada. But then, in addition, Dr. Riley recommends that we should decriminalize the drug MDMA because of the fact that it reduces symptoms. So for our first experiment, each participant received 16 items across the 3 general domains of expertise as presented in a random order. We broke these domains down into physical, social, and environmental. We wanted to target that the notion of going from a general fact to a more specific instance and also the degree of immediacy as prompted by the prescriptive condition. So to gauge willingness to defer, we asked participants 3 questions after each item. The first was, based on this info, how likely is it that you would support the given expertise? The second question was, does this change what you know about the given expertise? And the third question, to what extent do you trust the expert? So the results of our first experiment show that the participants did exhibit the predicted pattern and that they're more likely to defer to descriptive facts than prescriptive advice. This was evidenced in the support advice question and also the knowledge change question, but there wasn't an effect in the trust question. And also the patterns were consistent across all 3 domains of expertise, so that didn't have as much of an effect as we expected. So overall, we did have the predicted pattern in terms of descriptive information prompting greater deference to expertise than prescriptive advice. But the trust question was an exception. So here we noted that the trust question prompted judgment about an expert rather than the content of expertise. So this does suggest, though, that how expertise is framed has less impact on the judgments of an expert themselves and more impact on the judgment of the actual information. So this is something we followed up on in experiment 2. So for our second experiment, obviously aimed to replicate our first experiment, we also wanted to further explore the framing on trust judgments. So we changed that third trust question from asking about trusting the expert themselves to trusting the expertise provided. We also changed the framing of our domains of expertise into 2 conditions between personal and social. To do this, we just changed the prescriptive prompt from you should in the personal and then in the social to we should. We wanted to look at this to see if there was a difference between the social and personal framing of the expertise, potentially thinking that advice appealing to more personal consequence maybe would have less deference. So our results of experiment 2, the support advice question and the trust question did exhibit our predicted pattern of descriptive versus prescriptive, but only under the social condition and not under the personal appeal. Then the knowledge change question exhibited the predicted pattern under both the personal and social framing. And then across, we had higher deference for prescriptive advice under personal framing than social framing. So this actually contradicted one of our expectations there in terms of the personal relevance causing greater vigilance. So overall, we did have in experiment 1 and 2, there was in the prescriptive framing, there was less willingness to defer to expertise. We thought this was because the deontic statements offer potential obligation or inclination to act and thus requires greater epistemic vigilance. And this is pronounced in the social framing of the items. And then as a little bit of contradiction to our expectation to experiment 2, the personal framing does not always garner greater vigilance. And 2 explanations for this that we came up with is that social framing may actually have been more relevant in so much that the consequences of changes in knowledge to within one's community are actually of greater relevance because they're further beyond the control of the individual, whereas changing my own mind is within the grasp of my own volition. And also the social framing just may have been less compelling. Participants may have recognized that broader implications of the advice require greater evidence and or information. So just to conclude, we did find that there's a willingness to defer to experts dependent upon the form in which the expert testimony took, and that people were more willing to trust experts that provided factual details than they were ones that prescribed advice, especially as that advice became more audacious in its scope. This was seen in the social framing experiment too. And generally, these findings are consistent with views that people display a considerable degree of epistemic vigilance. The modifications to the items are rather minor, and the fact that they were proved sensitive to the processing of the expertise by the participants seems to suggest that. And also the findings may be related to findings regarding communities of knowledge. A couple practical, even positive implications is that we can better understand the distrust or denial of expert advice as seen in anti-vaccination movements, climate change denial, etc. And also the so-called post-truth challenges may be more in excess of vigilance and skepticism than they are gullibility or ignorance. So moving forward, we want to further look at how that balance is maintained between vigilance and also humility that ensures cohesion in communities of knowledge rather than fracturing into silos or bubbles of knowledge. So thank you.